Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, Threat Intelligence Naming Conventions, Threat Actors, Activity Groups, and Other Ways of Tracking Threats. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute. Today's featured speaker is Robert M. Lee, SANS instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Robert.
All right, thank you so much. So thanks everybody for joining me today. I want to talk about threat naming conventions. So to do that, I'm going to have to go through a variety of topics. And for those of you that have ever seen me speak or teach at SANS, you'll know that I can be a little bit ADD. So since it's a free flow of kind of ideas, I figured I'd switch it up and do a digital whiteboard instead of slides. So feel free to ask me questions along the way so I can actually answer those as well. But this is actually the first SANS webcast to not ever use slides. So we're all in a moment right now. Okay, this is a special event. Anyways, so for me, Rob Lee, started my career over at the U.S. Air Force, then spent my time at the National Security Agency, built out a mission looking at the nation states breaking into industrial sites. Jumped out, formed a company called Dragos, and we focus on industrial cybersecurity. And I authored the Forensics 578 class, which is the threat intelligence class, and the ICS 515 class, which is the active defense and incident response for industrial networks. So with that, let's get going and let's jump into it. So when all of this sort of came to a head for me when I wanted to do this webcast, it really came down to a basic, really good question that was positioned to me in class, in the 578 class, on sort of, is APT 29 the same as Fancy Bear? Or I think for them it's Cozy Bear specifically. The names are already kind of confusing, but when we think of APT 29, that's what FireEye calls the group. When you think of Cozy Bear, that's what CrowdStrike calls this group. And the question really boiled down to, are they the same? And that seems simple enough, but it also boils down to the second question, which is, does the name matter? Does the fact that they are or are not the same really matter for us? And for those of you, by the way, watching the whiteboard, I will have to tell you, yes, for those of you who know me, I'm the writer of the Little Bobby comic, but I'm going to stress that I'm the writer of the Little Bobby comic, not the illustrator. So you're going to have to suffer through. Most of the drawing is more for me than anybody as I collect my thoughts. But anyways, are these groups the same? And whether or not they are, does it matter? And what are the different types of naming conventions? And what are they useful for? Is it just people trying to redefine different ways to do business, or is it really differences that we can use to ultimately have different tools to do analysis? So what are the different names, or did I say naming conventions? And there's a bunch of them. So we're going to cover, in this third question, we're going to cover at least, see where the conversation goes, threat actors. We're also going to cover activity groups, which isn't as used as commonly, but is starting to become more popular, and campaigns. And then run off the slide there, and I'm just going to squiggle around at the end. Anyways, so threat actors, activity groups, and campaigns. What are these things? How are they used differently? What uses do we have? And I want to do a little bit of a nod as well to some previous work. So because I'm doing not slides, but instead just doing whiteboard, I'm not going to draw everything out. What I'll tell you is, if you're interested in this discussion and sort of the precursor work to it and some of the things that I've read and watched, a guy by the name of Joe Slowick did a presentation, and you can just go look up Joe Slowick and activity group. So go Google Joe Slowick and activity group, and it'll bring you to his different presentations on the topic. And then a guy by the name of Sergio, and just do names everywhere. If you Google those things, you'll find other research, other discussions. So Joe Slowick activity group and Sergio names everywhere. And those both some pretty good topics, pretty good look at this topic as well. And Sergio is actually the guy that wrote the DIAMOND model, which we'll also use in today's discussion. So right up front, different naming conventions. are they the same? Let's tackle that first one out the gate. To really understand if the names can actually represent the same thing, we have to look at how they get formed. At the basis of everything we as intelligence professionals do, there's the classic kind of intelligence life cycle, and you'll usually see it in a funnel, and people will talk and say, well, look, you do, a lot of collection of data, and from that data, you end up taking that data and turning it into a little bit less of information, and you take a little bit less of that information and turn that into intel. And so when we look at how data, information, intelligence gets created, it's off this idea that we have a lot of collection that we're starting with. But one of the things that I'd position to you, and one of the really the fundamental discussion points for us, is your collection, no matter how much collection you think you have, whether you're at a government level, a security vendor with endpoint protection systems and firewalls and intrusions sort of around the community or whatever, VirusTotal sort of parsing, no matter what it is, your collection is far more limited than you realize in comparison to all the collection that's out there. It is a significant difference in how much you can see versus how much everyone else can see. And I don't think most people realize the limitations of their collection. So as an example, if the US government in its collection looks at attacks against the Department of Defense networks, I would position that maybe the Russian government doesn't have the same collection, but they probably have visibility into attacks against their government. In the same way, name any of your good vendors. I'm only going to name today like vendors that I like and sort of the good ones. So let's say Symantec comes out and looks at their endpoint protection network, and they see the different data that's coming off of their customer networks. But from just a sort of an understanding of which detections are firing, again, that data is not going to really overlap, not one for one with, say, a McAfee. So let's dig into that. When FireEye, let's go answer that question. I'm picking on FireEye and CrowdStrike today because I do think highly of both firms, but let's start with them. So if FireEye comes out and says, here's APT 29, and CrowdStrike comes out and says, this is Cozy Bear. Effectively, how they've done that, and not to speak for all their sources about this, but effectively how they do it is they see intrusions. And an intrusion is really any successful or failed attempt by the adversary to try to get into an organization. So they attempted to get into an organization. And a lot of people use various models to do intrusion analysis. One of them is the kill chain that gets referenced a lot. There's a variety of different models to use than just the kill chain. But it's that idea that there's going to be some early reconnaissance and then weaponization and then delivery and so forth until finally we get to actions on objectives and adversaries do things in that environment. Each one of those intrusions is going to have data at different points that is observable and interesting, but not all the fields are going to be interesting. As any given company goes and looks at intrusions, they're going to start picking out things that they find interesting to them. And so FireEye might figure out that a specific piece of malware or a coding routine or keyboard setting or timestamps related to compile times of malware or infrastructure choices, these various characteristics, it's going to, I had a question on, did it start? Can everybody see my screen? I'm going to pause for a second. Carol, can you see my screen? Or am I just getting trolled? Oh, we're seeing it. Yes, we can. I'm getting trolled already by people because I'm using a whiteboard. Look at you guys. Nice. All right. I got to give props on that one. All right. So anyways, when we look at these intrusions, I love this hands audience. All right. When we look at these intrusions, each company or organization is going to pick out things that are interesting to them. So FireEye is going to go and they're going to look at their intrusions, and they're going to have various depths and visibility into these intrusions. And really, I would position that Cozy Bear and APT 29 cannot actually be the same thing. The reason I would say they cannot be the same thing, like they're not a one-for-one match, is the intrusions that FireEye sees and the intrusions that CrowdStrike sees from their own networks are largely going to be different. They might have some overlap, but it won't be a one-for-one overlap. Because as FireEye goes in and does their incident response and has their endpoint protection system for one set of customers, CrowdStrike's going to have a different set of customers. And again, they might overlap in some places, especially when they're both looking in places like VirusTotal for malware data. There will be some overlaps, but it is not a one-for-one. And so realistically, the reason they have to use different names is because they actually are different. They actually are different things. And CrowdStrike doesn't want to inherit the analytical baggage that FireEye has around what they're highlighting about those intrusions. Because if we think about it, this is analysis. As each one of these intrusions is recorded, the FireEye analysts are picking pieces and clustering those intrusions to select certain things from it to highlight and pull up into their higher order analysis. They're not using every single raw data point of every single intrusion. So they've already sub-selected the data to highlight stuff that they find important, which may not be the same things that CrowdStrike finds important. And so as these naming conventions seem to cross, and sometimes I think people think it's just marketing, it's actually because they are different sets of intrusions and the things that people find of value are different. So you don't want a FireEye analyst to inherit the analytical baggage of Cozy Bear or CrowdStrike on APT29, because there's decisions that were already pre-made about that data, and you effectively lose control. And for everybody, regardless if you're a security company or not, you don't want to lose control of the discussion. As an example, you don't want to be in front of your executive saying, look, we're tracking a threat actor that's targeting our company, and we're a bank. And here's what they're doing, and here's their tradecraft, and here's what we need to prioritize in defense. But if you're just using the vendor's name on intrusions that you're analyzing, and you use it as a one-for-one, that vendor might say, oh yeah, and this threat actor is now doing these crazy things, and oh my gosh, you gotta be careful, when it may not actually map to any of your requirements internally. So that brings us to a second really important topic that gets back to this threat actor discussion, which is intelligence requirements. Realistically, all of these models and all the analysis done is set to form an intelligence requirement. In other words, what is the knowledge gap, or what is the pain point that I'm trying to satisfy with the analysis that I'm trying to do? What's the question that I'm trying to satisfy for my consumers? Because intelligence is not made for intelligence purposes. Intelligence is made for others. So what am I trying to do with it? And the intelligence requirement around threat actors, there's a variety of them, but a lot of it is around attribution. Now, not necessarily true attribution of it is Rob Lee, or it is PLA operator, or it is PLA, or it is China, but around an attribution to say it is APT29. And so when people are adding data points into a threat actor, so if we're using that specific connotation, they're effectively trying to match up the intrusions and identify which ones fit or don't fit the actor, the grouping that they have, and then adding it to that actor. It's about attribution. It's about tracking, which is a really good intelligence requirement. I don't like attribution for the who specifically is it. It's China versus Russia. I've given enough talks on why I don't think that's actually that valuable. But to know that it is APT29 and APT29 has done these set of things over the last decade, that can be a pretty important context. Like that can be a really important requirement, especially strategically for folks to track. So if that is the intelligence requirement, and that's a big if, but if the intelligence requirement is about attribution, then if CrowdStrike came up with Cozy Bear and also came to the fact that it too is Russia, which that's what these analysts came up with, is that Cozy Bear and APT29 are the Russian government, then as long as the analysis sort of delivered on the intelligence requirement in the same way, it actually doesn't matter that they're structurally different. And this is where we kind of have to pause for a second and think about it, because that seems a little off. Well, you mean that we both can do something different and come up with the same answer and it's okay, even though that all the math that went into it is different? Yeah, actually, it's okay. If you went through and used a structured model and were consistent along your data to satisfy the intelligence requirement, and another team or organization did the same thing, even if your data was different, if you got to the same place in the end and you were able to satisfy your intelligence requirement, I'd position that you both did a good job. So I actually think that if you're tracking, especially on intelligence requirements, and or not just intelligence requirements, but intelligence requirements for attribution, and you're specifically trying to look at things like strategically understanding the long-term groupings of these threat actors, then it is good enough to say that these two are similar in nature. It's not really okay, though, to say that they are the same thing. They are not really the same threat actors. And we've seen this in various documents. I think one of the famous ones was the Grizzly Step report from the FBI and DHS. It was not the most well-received report. I sort of famously critiqued it a lot as well. But they made a one-for-one inference that said Sophisy is APT289 is Cozy Bear. And that's not actually accurate. But for the purpose of what they were doing of talking about Russian attribution, it was okay. Okay, so that's one way to do things. What's the big pain point? Well, in the way that I do things, and another way that I teach it in class and have done it at my company, and I've seen it done at other companies, like Microsoft tracks things this way, is to talk about activity groups. So that's another naming convention. And as soon as anybody publishes on something new, like an activity group, and I saw this firsthand where our firm came out and said, here's 7 new activity groups to track. Here's 7 that we're tracking that target specifically industrial networks. One of the first questions we got from analysts was, well, what are these groups tied to? What do these represent? Which one is APT289? Which one is Sandworm? Which one is, name your flavor? And our pushback was, it's not, it's different. We said, well, look, this one group has ties to the Lazarus group. And so of course the media instantly ran with it and said, aha, they did attribution in North Korea. No, we didn't. Well, you said it was tied to Lazarus group, and Lazarus group is North Korea. Therefore, this new group is North Korea. Well, actually, attribution really doesn't have a transitive property like that. But activity groups are really focused on a different intelligence requirement than threat actors altogether. And everybody can do it differently. But let's explore, as an example, what the pain point that an activity group is trying to do differently than a threat group. If I look at, or I say a threat actor, if I look at a threat actor, one of the problems for me as a defender, and this is different than just an intelligence analyst, but as a defender, is if I tell you defend against, we've picked on all of them for a while, so let's use Sophisy as a naming convention. If I say defend against Sophisy, well, Sophisy is about tracking the attribution of that threat actor. So if I'm a company that wants to defend against Sophisy, I've got to now ask follow-on questions. Well, what year of Sophisy are we talking about? What victimology of Sophisy are we talking about? What different malware families are we talking about from Sophisy? Because all those intrusions that got bundled up into what became the Sophisy threat actor changes. And this is very simple to see even in the previous APT289 discussions on 1 year targeting journalists in the Caucasus regions, 1 year targeting election infrastructure, another year targeting German parliaments. And so there's themes that people pick out and go, well, yeah, but there's a Russian state interest. And we're going to come back to that at the end of the discussion. But there might be this discussion of, oh, well, there's a Russian state interest. Sure. And it's useful for intelligence tracking. But from a defender's perspective, if I'm going to defend against the tradecraft and the capabilities and the infrastructure of Sophisy, I'm not actually well prepared to do that off of a threat actor, because I have a lot of follow-on questions that I have to answer first to get to the specifics to make it useful and relevant and applicable to me. This is also where we hear the term like actionable. Like, is this actionable to me or not? Is this relevant to me or not? And technically at some point, something like Sophisy could be relevant to technically everybody as the operations of that group expand over the years. So going back to activity groups, what is the intelligence requirement of an activity group? Well, it depends on you, but for me as an example, the intelligence requirement for an activity group is to successfully track the tradecraft of these actors, and in combination with attributes of the diamond model that I care about. So activity groups are defined in a paper called the diamond model. It was authored, like I said, by Sergio, and basically the diamond model effectively defines a mathematical approach to understanding how you're classifying data from intrusions into a clustering. And the vertices here of the diamond model are pretty simple. There's the adversary vertice, there's the capability or tradecraft, because it might not be capability, it could just be tradecraft and methods of an adversary. There's the victimology, and there's the infrastructure. And so as I look at any given intrusion, I as an analyst can select capability and tradecraft or victims or infrastructure related to that adversary, that activity group that I'm tracking, that matter to me. And so as I come out with a group, I might say dimalloy, the activity group dimalloy, is specifically targeting US electric providers. They're doing it with a specific type of internal, let's say internal screenshot grabs of HMIs, human machine interfaces inside of electrical environments. So when they basically action objectives, they're taking screenshots of HMIs. And I might say that the infrastructure they're using is legitimate but compromised engineering websites used for integrators in North America. And so I've subsetted down something specific. So it's not okay just to say fishing. Like I couldn't just put like fishing as tradecraft because that's not something specific in my data set. But in my data set, what is something specific that I find value of that I can put into the DIAM model? And that also can help reveal, I don't want to jump around too much, but that can help reveal why this changes team to team, because what's specific in my data set and useful to me may not be specific in your data set and useful to you. As an aside, the old malware Poison Ivy at one point was pretty specific to various Chinese-based activity groups. But later on in life, I mean, as time went on and as Poison Ivy became pretty commonly used, it was no longer specific to anything. So the specificity of data can not only change with time, but it is based on your collection. So you gotta be careful with that. But basically in the DIAM model, I'm going to define things that are specific in my data set to me. And what I've done here is I've now bound that intrusion data to exactly what I'm looking for, exactly what I care about, and exactly who it's relevant for. And this is where it gets tricky, if we think about dimalloy and sort of the humans behind dimalloy, the actors, if you will, behind dimalloy, as they change, the question is, do I add new victims? Do I add new infrastructure? Do I add new capabilities into the DIAM model, or do I make another group? And this again comes down to that personal choice that's defined in the DIAM model paper, and you need to be consistent, but you can do it differently. As an example, I might say that I have a low confidence sort of view into customer networks. And so whether or not it's electric or not, for me, is pretty low. I have pretty good view into infrastructure, and I'm good at tracking infrastructure, and I value that a lot. So my infrastructure vertice is moderate confidence, kind of a moderate view. And tradecraft is pretty specific. So I'm going to say that's a high value item. And the simplicity of what I'm saying here is if I find dimalloy also targeted water, because it's a low change, it's a change on something that I'm weighting low in my model, I might just add it in. But if I find that I've got two things that change on moderate, or I've got one thing that changes on high, I might make that a whole nother group and say, okay, well now it's no longer dimalloy, maybe it's now allanite. And allanite does target electric, but they're specifically using university-based IP addresses. And they're specifically also, instead of going after HMI screenshots, they're stealing off engineering work documents out of electric utilities. And that's just different off of what I expected to see from a group, or in this case, it might not be. But this is a great example of showing that the activity groups are now bound to a specific set of tradecraft and victimology and infrastructure as I've defined it based off of my analytical model to capture that data. Now, the weird truth of all this, and this next statement is not true, but this like the next example is not a real one, but maybe they're both APT 28. Maybe that's true. Maybe they both mapped APT 28, but it's actually not a one-for-one, and it's not a guarantee, and you don't necessarily have the capability of rolling up activity groups into a threat actor because, and this is where it's going to go take one more jump and gets a little weird, but if another adversary adopts all the things that we're seeing, I don't really care. And the question might be, what if it's a false flag? And the response is, what are you talking about with a false flag? I'm not doing attribution with dimalloy, so no one's fooling me on a false flag. I'm focused on the defense by looking for specific characteristics and making sure that it's relevant to me so I can defend against it. So the reason you shouldn't just map it to an actor and say, oh, this is an operation for that actor, or this is somehow related to them, is it has nothing to do with attribution. Activity group tracking is 100% focused on the how are they doing it, not the who is doing it, where threat actors are more of the who. Cool. So the last one I said we'd touch on is campaigns. And this gets used a lot, and this is the only one that I don't really like. You can justify doing anything you want. And as long as it's satisfying intelligence requirements in a predictable way where you're using a structured way that works for you and your team, I've got no problem with that. But I do think campaigns have a big limitation. So when I'm tracking threat actors and when I'm tracking activity groups, I'm defining an intelligence model. I'm defining an analytical model about how I'm doing that, whether it's the diamond model or I'm clustering intrusions against a different model, or using, maybe I'm tracking, MITRE ATT&CK framework for sort of the tradecraft that's specific that I care about. There's a variety of different ways to do this, but I have control as an intelligence analyst when it comes to threat actors and activity groups. And I think both they're great. They complement each other. Threat actor tracking, especially for intelligence requirements related to attribution, activity group tracking, especially for things related to bounding against a specific set of clustered data that changes when the data changes. The only problem I really have is campaigns. So what campaigns effectively are, and again, you can use them, but I'm going to tell you why I don't like them. What campaigns effectively are is an understanding of the mission of the adversary. So it could be, usually they're used with threat actors, but I could have some group, some actor, and a campaign is saying, look, this is their campaign against the electric sector, or this is their campaign against the banking sector. And those campaigns or operations names might change based on the changes of the victimology. But the real focus of a campaign is usually time, and it's usually an understanding of the mission or who is being targeted or what the adversary is trying to do. It's almost based on intent. It's an intent of the adversary. Where if we all get together and go hack a bunch of banks, maybe they call us, cash register squirrel. But if we get a little bit of liquor in us and we all go target the electric grid, maybe they call us sparkling squirrel or something. It's this naming conventions that are usually bound to campaigns of mission objective of the adversary. The reason I don't like that is because I don't know the limitations of my own collection. I don't actually know when that campaign really started, and I don't know really who they were targeting. I know a minimum. I know that so I do a lot of industrial things. So I use a lot of examples from here, but it applies to anything. But I know that in 2013, we started seeing Dragonfly target the electric sector. And so there was a number of reports that came out to say, hey, it's a campaign active in 2013 and it's targeted towards the electric sector. But that's, again, not really true. The reality of it is it at least started in 2013. We don't know if it was going before because we don't have the collection to support that. And it's at least targeting the electric sector, but there could be other sectors that are being targeted that we don't see. As an example, you might go to the person that's making this analysis and saying, well, hey, do you have any bank customers? Do you have any mining customers? And based off where they're doing collection, they may not actually be able to make the assessments about who all is being targeted. And this can be a big challenge. And I've seen this time and time again, where we as intelligence analysts go to companies and go to our decision leaders and security folks and say, oh yeah, this is a campaign and it's targeted towards us as the bank. And the next thing that happens is they'll hear about a campaign and they go, well, this one's not targeted towards banks, so we're not going to look into doing defense against this because it's not relevant to us. When in reality, we might not make it a priority because we don't have proof it's targeted towards us, but the tradecraft and the things that adversary is doing might not only be extremely relevant, but it also might already be targeting us, and we just don't have intelligence to support that yet. So naturally, intelligence is trying to inform better decisions, and so priorities will form, but campaigns we don't control. Whereas I control what goes into the threat actor and the activity group kind of structure, I don't really control what goes into campaigns. It's just a fleeting moment of my visibility into collection and then an inference off of the adversary. They decide when they start. They decide who they target. They decide why they targeted them. And getting to a real answer on those things can be very difficult as analysts, and it may not actually satisfy our intelligence requirements anyways. So back from the beginning, threat actors and activity groups and campaigns. I think this is actually point 3 if I remember correctly. Use whichever ones you want. If you're doing threat actors, you're going to have to define some model. It's usually on clustering of intrusions and abstracting out things that are useful to you. Heck, you could even technically use some abstract like the DIME model to do it and prioritizing the different attributes that are useful to you. If you're doing activity groups, it is much more around the how, not the who. It's the bounding and clustering of that activity data. So there really is no one-for-one correlation between a threat actor and an activity group at all. We might say that the malware or the infrastructure used by this activity group has been seen and used by that threat actor, but that doesn't necessarily mean much. Campaigns, I'd tell you to be cautious with campaigns. I'm not a huge fan, but maybe you have some uses that work for you. On threat actors, realize what intelligence requirements go into them, and it's usually around the who. But if you have a big security vendor that's taking care of you, there are your security provider and your intelligence provider, then your intelligence requirement of who, by knowing a specific group, might actually be really relevant to you. But if you're going out more and like hunting for a specific adversary, or you're trying to be more proactive in your own environments, an activity group might meet your requirements. There really is no right answer. There is no better tool. And it is funny to me how much feedback, including sort of on the Twitter exchange that started this discussion where I was like, let's do a webcast. And how many Intel analysts want to say, well, which one's right? And how does it map together? Well, that's just not how the world works. They are different, and it's good that we have different tools. When people do things in a different way and can define a repeatable process for them to do that thing to meet a requirement, that's just pushing the field forward. So you want more tools in your box. You don't want to try to play favorites and say which one's better. But again, do be careful of those models that you have trouble defining. And again, when it comes back to is APT 29 Cozy Bear, I would tell you it's not. It may be okay anyways, especially for the purpose of attribution, but these are not the same groups. So be very, very careful with how you use that. All right, so I've got plenty of other topics to go into and ways to do this, but before I do, I told you I'd make this interactive. So let's go ahead and jump into some questions because I see a bunch of them. And I hope less of them are trolling than when we had the question about viewing my screen. All right, so the first one. Yes, the United States intelligence community may know who's who, but for the public and the media, they don't. And congresswomen and men may know, but they can't talk about it. The point isn't that APT 28 somehow scrolled down where it lost the question. I'm sure it was a really good question. Hold on, going back. Yeah, there we go. The point isn't that APT 28 and Fancy Bear are not one-to-one. The point is that they are both intrusion sets sponsored by the GRU. The bottom line is the intelligence values the Russian military is responsible and not, and then it gets into a bunch of political rhetoric. All right, so I'm going to cut it off at the political stuff. On the question, again, you're 100% correct. The intelligence requirement was, did Russia, were they involved, I should say, in the DNC hack? That's what you're referring to, it seems. And the analysis that was done by the various companies was around threat actors. And if I'm really trying to get to a discussion of attribution, then I do want to have an understanding of attribution in the way that I'm doing campaign analysis or group analysis as well. So a threat actor view is actually really appropriate for that requirement. Now, is it accurate and the politics behind it? That's a completely different discussion, and neither here nor there. It's much more around, yes, threat actors was the appropriate choice for that intelligence requirement. If you were trying to say, how do I defend against this group, I think you would have used more of the activity group. All right, so let's go to the next question. Can you touch on the immediate tactical advantage of discerning a campaign, like a campaign against an industry versus a threat actor or activity group? I consider the former being more tactically useful than threat actor or activity group model, i.e. it would be more tactically advantageous to speak on a campaign against a target industry versus an activity or threat group. Great question. Basically, the question is, if I can define a campaign correctly, I could really talk about its focus on a specific industry, where maybe a threat actor, it's definitely not going to get that for me. But an activity group, it might also have multiple industries depending on how I've evaluated the victimology of it. And my pushback to you is, what you're essentially saying is, I now care more about victimology, so the victimology might be high for you. And so what is one activity group to you is not going to be the same to me, where you might say this one industry is high to me. So if I'm at a organization that I'm trying to defend, the victimology might be the highest thing on my group. Is it or is it not targeted towards me? Is it or is it not targeted towards my industry? And so I would define that as high on the diamond model sort of equation there, and track things based off that. Again, the problem with campaign is you're still largely forcing your analysis off of things that you can't necessarily collect against. So it's not that campaigns are bad, it's that they're unwieldy. You don't really define what goes in and out of a campaign that well because your collection is limited. So I would say that everything you're trying to get at is really doable in an activity group instead. But if you want to do a campaign for it, that's also perfectly fine. I think that you would just weight the victimology a little bit differently than someone else, though. All right, some time ago, there was a movement in the AV community to avoid naming viruses after threat actors or artifacts of the code in order to avoid encouraging the actors to sort of get famous. Do you think the principle still applies to threat actor naming? And if so, is it equally applicable to nation states, criminals, and so forth? Great question. So I don't like naming activity groups, threat actors, sort of any naming convention that we want after code or after malware names. So as an example, I want to pick on Kaspersky now. So I actually really like a lot of their analysts, and they had the great team or whatever. I thought they did great work. A whole lot of other discussions out there, but I thought they did some great work there. But I'm going to pick on them since I usually also very much highlight them. When they tracked one group or actor, I don't even know if it was an actor, but they tracked a group. They said it was Black Energy 3 or Black Energy, I forget, APT. It was this group, this clustering was the Black Energy team, if you will. And the problem with that to me is Black Energy is a piece of malware. And that grouping or clustering, it can change, and the actor may not use that piece of malware anymore. And it's really odd to say, yeah, the Black Energy APT is now using, some other piece of malware. You're like, what? Well, it's named Black Energy. Why are they not using Black Energy anymore? And you introduce friction to your consumer and being able to consume that data because they're too caught up in your naming convention. To me, naming conventions need to be flexible. They need to be able to adapt to support whatever your requirement is, so that if malware, infrastructure, or victims change, the naming convention doesn't change unless you truly intend to change your group by that. If you are really only tracking an activity group based off of Black Energy usage, then it's probably not the worst thing. But if you are tracking it based off of multiple components, which you really should, if you're doing a diamond model as an example, you're really looking for a 2+ correlation. So you really need two vertices that you're tracking, no matter which ones they are. Those are sort of your weighted ones. You can track all three, but the 2 is really your weighted ones. So I still wouldn't track it just by Black Energy as an example, but your names need to be flexible. So again, I've said some nice things about CrowdStrike as well. So let me say some maybe educational things. I don't say not nice things, but the way that CrowdStrike's naming convention works, I personally don't like. I think it's great for marketing. It's brilliant marketing. And I like I said, I really like the folks over there. But if I say Fancy Bear, you immediately think Russia. If I say Samurai Panda, you immediately think China. And so the problem is the naming convention also carries analytical baggage, and it's not flexible. So if I find out that I was wrong, and attribution is difficult. So if I find out that I was wrong and Fancy Bear is actually probably a Chinese-based group, then I have to come out to my consumers and go, hey, yeah, look, we've been calling it Fancy Bear, but it's not really Russian, it's Chinese, but pandas are bears too, so it's okay. No, now I've just introduced a lot of confusion. So really, I want my names to be consistent, but abstract and flexible in nature. So I do think that naming them based off of things like malware is not the appropriate approach, or basing naming conventions off attribution isn't the appropriate approach. But also to your more significant point, which is, do we think that they take pride in the reports by us building them up. My own personal bias, it's hard to tell, right? My own personal bias would say yes, they do, and we need to be very careful in that. We don't want to encourage jerks that are breaking into companies to be able to read a report and be like, oh yeah, they think I'm awesome. It's not exactly the top priority of your nation state operators or cyber criminals usually, but I think it's enough risk that we pose some risk in incentivizing behavior that we don't want to see. Cool. So the next question is, what do you think of the MITRE ATT&CK framework in relation to intelligence and TTP, sort of tactics, techniques, and tradecraft? I think the MITRE ATT&CK framework fits very nice. So for those of you that haven't seen it, I usually make jokes in the sense that I really like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but it's almost cultish in that I can't give a single presentation. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a good question, but I can't give a single presentation or class without somebody asking me about attack. And that's good. It's actually a good job by the MITRE folks and for sort of encouraging a lot of questions on it. So attack essentially says, here are different tactics, techniques, and procedures. And remember, TTPs are different things. A lot of people use, and that's kind of a weasel word, but I see a lot of folks using TTP as one word, but a tactic might be something really high level, like this is spear phishing. A technique might be I'm using macros enabled in Word documents, and a procedure might be I'm using these specific commands in PowerShell to sort of activate it. So it's not necessarily the same thing. Anyways, I digress. Going back, I think attack maps really well for everybody. It's not an activity group or a threat actor thing. It is just an understanding of what's the tradecraft. And I've seen some teams, I think Palo Alto as an example, put out, I think it was them, put out a playbook guide. They said, like, here's SOPHACY, and according to attack, I'm just going to use I know it's not A, but according to attack, here are TTPs observed by SOPHACY. And that's perfectly fine and perfectly accessible. I still would say it's not really, if I'm going to be a little bit of a purist here and say it's not necessarily, to me, the best way to track it, because SOPHACY is about who, attack is really about how. And so there could be a point, if SOPHACY keeps continuing, that the TTPs just get layered and layered and layered and layered and layered until it's like everything. But if I were to define an activity group, it really is bound to tradecraft as an example. So I could say this is the attack tradecraft for this activity group, and it will never change. This activity group is this tradecraft, and as the tradecraft changes, we'll come up with a new activity group and let you know if it's relevant to you or not. So I think it fits in anywhere, but I do think it has a pretty good use with activity groups. All right, let's see, how does it differ organizing threat actors by the diamond model? Yeah, so this is a good question as well, because threat actors doesn't mean that you can't use the diamond model. It's the same thing with the kill chain. You can use a kill chain for any variety of reasons, but again, it really goes back to the intelligence requirement. As attributes of the diamond model change, are you going to change the naming convention? If so, it's more activity groups that you're talking about. But if you're not going to change the naming convention and you're just going to layer on more attributes to the diamond model, that's perfectly fine. Because in essence, you're still clustering data, you're still clustering intrusions, but you're just allowing your data set to grow over time. And because you're doing that, because you're more interested in tracking who did it. Nothing wrong with that, especially for your intelligence requirement. And I hate to be like the typical Intel analyst, but there's a giant it depends on this whole discussion of what are you trying to do? What are you trying to accomplish? Of course, plenty of people are asking about fuzzy snuggly duck. I find that to be incredibly appropriate for the conversation. All right, how do we get people out of the practice with calling everything a campaign? Because not everything is a campaign. And based on my old military training, a campaign is based in, like you said, space and time and aimed at a strategic or operational objective. Wouldn't something like what you just mentioned just be an event, incident, or operation? Yeah, absolutely. This is another problem with the word campaign, is it's extremely loaded and it's an inherently military term. And so people that have a military background look at the word campaign completely differently than most other folks. And not only is it bound to time and sort of visibility and objectives, but as you noted, it might have a lot of different events or incidents or operations that make up that campaign. So you do have to be very careful with words. It's another reason I really don't like using that word at all. It's really easy and it's really hard at the same time to get out of using that word. I struggle with this, but I really have to try to keep myself to threat actors and activity groups. And then I also talk about incidents, and various events that occurred. And you could throw in the word operation, but I still think that's really military and I don't like it. But you might also talk about clusters to say, and gets the old term, especially for those that come out from an intelligence community background, of intrusion set, to say, look, there was a intrusion set for the targeting of the journalists in the Caucasus regions after MH17 was shot down. The various intrusions into the journalists that we saw had shared commonality to show us that the intrusions were likely orchestrated by the same actor. There's an intrusion set. I'm not fully defining it as a threat actor. I'm not focusing necessarily on all the activity group stuff yet, but I'm saying that there is a clustering of intrusions here related to this event, and it's interesting to track. I find that to be a more effective approach. For me personally, as an analyst, I try to stick to these two naming conventions. For my intelligence requirements of doing defense and hunting and working with organizations, I stick to activity groups. I really don't care about attribution, but some people do. That's just my own personal preference. Let's see. Oh man, this is I love this style. I'm going to do this more often where I just do whiteboards because there are so many questions and I can actually get through them for once. What do you think of the spreadsheet that Florian Roth and others created to cross-reference the myriad of group op names associated data? Is it a good approach to keep tabs on groups globally, or is it ultimately flawed by collection biases, as you discussed? Cool. I actually like Florian. I've never met him in person. I've referenced him a couple times in my own class for like the YARA rules and stuff he's done. And I actually have sort of that spreadsheet as a slide in my class as well. And I'll tell you sort of how I view it. And essentially what it is it's a Rosetta Stone. It's a translation device. But again, it goes back to your intelligence requirement. If my intelligence requirement is I'm a team inside my company and I have to be able to brief up my security folks and my executives about what's going on, not only in my own company, but outside my company, and guide strategic, operational, and tactical level requirements. That's my team. I really need to be aware of what's going on in the industry. And if I'm tracking it internally, I am never, ever, 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 ever going to use somebody else's name. In other words, if I see the intrusions, I'm doing the analysis, I refuse to use someone else's name. So if you're internal to a company, so you're a company doing this type of work, you're going to come up with your internal names. And the last thing I ever want you to do is to use the vendor names, because you lose control and all the analytical baggage now becomes the vendor term, and it gets instilled in your mind for your security folks and your executives. So when they hear something about APT whatever or fancy whoever, they automatically start thinking, oh, and here's how I need to use that. But you may not want to have them use that information. I want to control the narrative and the discussion. So I want names that my company came up with and to control that discussion. But I do need to be able to translate it. If this is my requirement, I do need to be able to translate it and say, well, here's FireEye's naming conventions, here's CrowdStrike, here's Symantec, here's Palo Alto, whoever, and have that sort of a cross-reference of which ones map, if you will, to the names that I'm tracking. And I don't do this for purpose of saying this naming convention is this group, and it is this group. What I do instead is I would use it to say, well, if my executive, as an example, says, well, APT 29 was just reported to do this, and I heard it in the news. Well, sir, ma'am, we're tracking that as, fuzzy snuggly duck. And fuzzy snuggly duck, based off of our intelligence, is not doing those things. We advise that we should take these actions instead and make these other investments in the areas that will drive defense based in our SOC or IR team or however we're structured. In other words, you want to control the narrative, but you do want to have a translation to basically filter in. I think one good intelligence requirement for a lot of intel analysts is filtering all the crap your people get inundated with. As they become more interested in a topic of security, they're going to hear and see much more media and vendor reports and marketing. They go to a trade show and they come back with all the ick of vendors on them of all these naming conventions. It's not bad, but it's there's also sales tactics in there. Not done for that reason, but it happens. So I want to control the narrative. I want to know my name, but I do want to have a reference to be able to cross-reference to say, you were talking about Covalite. That's how we track it. And here's what you need to know about Covalite. Don't worry, we have you covered. Because ultimately, you do want to show that you're tracking things correctly and that you have good confidence in your own analysis and that the people that depend on you can have confidence in you. I don't like it for the purpose outside of that of saying, here's these groups, they are the same. Because I can't speak for Florian, but that's how I've seen a lot of people use that spreadsheet on this group is this group is this group. And Florian and I even got a little bit of a Twitter discussion where he's like, well, your activity groups, I'm tracking them as operations for these threat actors. And my response was, okay, you can do whatever you want in your spreadsheet, but that's not right. That these activity groups are not operations of other people's threat actors. So I think that strikes a inherently human need to put things in a spreadsheet, inherently human need to make a one-for-one reference on things, to just structure data and insights in a way that suits our purposes. And it's not necessarily how intelligence works. And I also have I don't want to be a little bit crispy here, but I have a little bit of a beef where a lot of the way that we look at threat intel today in the community is IOCs and malware analysis. And to me, that is not really intel. Like, malware analysis can support intel, very much so, and IOCs are kind of like the exhaust fumes of them, but they aren't intel. Essentially what's happening, and I think a big risk for our community, is as teams go out and track threat actors, or activity groups for that matter, but usually with threat actors, they put a lot of weight on malware. Why? Because the collection set up over the years has been malware based. Anti-malware companies are focused on malware. Vulnerabilities and the exploits using them, and malware using exploits. It's like a very product security focused of this whole discussion. And there's all these other aspects that we should be paying a lot of attention to. It's not that people don't, but it's almost unanimously across companies a really significantly high focus on malware. And especially as teams use different malware across their different activities, or they maybe don't use malware at all and it's more of living on the land kind of techniques, that becomes more difficult to track, especially if your main collection source is anti-malware kind of collection. So I see a little bit of risk from the way that we're tracking things as well. Because actually, I'm going to throw another curveball, and this one's a little bit kind of an interesting topic that I'm actively exploring. But if you're tracking malware more than the infrastructure or the victims that are getting sort of compromised and used, then you're probably actually tracking the developers of the malware. You're not actually tracking the operators. And so this goes back to another reason I have a problem with the WHO, is there isn't just one adversary. It's not like this is that PLA team or GRU team or NSA team or AD100 team or whatever. There's like developers of malware, and that may not even be one team. There's your infrastructure prep teams. There's your kick down the doors, sort of do the operations initially teams. There's the like teams on target that can sort of collect off the data. There's the analysis teams that might be using that. And then there's like customers that actually use the intelligence that adversaries are collecting for whatever various reasons. So when I say adversary, it's not even one team necessarily. In any complex organization, we could be talking about, half a dozen different groups and teams. It's another reason I really, really, really am bothered by the attribution discussion. Again, I kind of keep teasing it, but saying I've sort of spoken on that enough. And to me, this adds a lot of complexity. And so by our need to force things and say, well, I'm tracking this malware, therefore it is this group, or I saw them register infrastructure in a different way, therefore it is this group. If you're doing it from a threat actor basis of attribution, I think there's a lot of risk in missing out on a lot of topics. And you might be falling for some pretty simple like mirror biasing type intelligence failures. Anyways, let's see. There's some funny ones. That's good. How do you track all this? Yeah, that's a good one. Tracking tools. Man, there's a whole other webcast to be done on that. MISP, Excel. I'm just reading off here. He said MISP, Excel, internal tools. Yeah, there's a variety of things. And so, I think if we look at all of our various vendors out there, Threat Connect, Anomaly, Eclectic IQ, Threat Quotient, Recorded Future, there's a big market out there for like TIPS, threat intelligence platforms. There's MISP, there's CRITS. There's so many different tools. Excel, which is like the best intel tool of all time and unifies all teams everywhere. It just depends on your requirements. Like for me personally, when we're tracking a lot of malware-based data, I found that we use like MISP for like malware artifacts. When we're tracking like activity groups and keeping sort of track of analysis and the data points that went into them, we had to roll sort of our own system that was more based on like notes taking and tagging of data and journaling almost of what was going on. So more analysis is almost more unstructured. These kind of tools can be extremely effective as you deal with external teams and you want to pass off like a blacklist for the proxy group to be able to block IPs off of something that you effectively went through, and sort of it's the byproduct of your intel, but it's still useful to that team. There's a lot of other things, or record a future. We have like I use it as an example. I have like a dashboard specific to like ICS threats that I want to track. I mean, it depends on your requirement. For me, a lot of this ends up being tracking of malware and tracking of infrastructure and technical data points, and then having an unstructured kind of tagging system with journaling to be able to track notes and things across teams. I've even seen people do it in just like OneNote or Google Drive. You just got to be careful with like the cloud implications and sensitivity of data. Cool. So we got a couple minutes left. We got a lot of questions. I love this. For any of you, here's the shameless plug. For any of you that are super interested in this topic of how to take a single intrusion, walk it through to get to an activity group, to walk it through to make the recommendations on like TTPs and doing defense in your networks, I wrote a class on it called Forensics 578. That's a major focus, not just on like indicators and stuff, but really focus around intrusion analysis. But let's answer like 2 more questions and then we'll cut it off. What is preferred method of tracking various indicators along the DIAM model and cyber kill chain in order to help define activity groups Excel? Oh, you had the exact same question that was done before. Great question though. I do like using the kill chain in conjunction with the DIAM model. I think the kill chain has that was a really bad diamond. I think the kill chain has a lot of bad rap sometimes because people have looked at sort of the marketing of it more than the actual model. The model is really effective at just putting data into buckets. It's really just a classifier of this data goes here and here and here and here and here. And as long as I'm consistently tagging my data the same way, I can then do queries against that data to ask questions. And those questions can be things that I put into my model. And yeah, notes, journaling, Excel, all those things can be super useful for that. So how do we, as threat intelligence professional, get people out of the threat intel means malware and IOCs to more traditional analytic point of view? Okay, so how do we move the community along? Here's my biggest recommendation to you. I'm going to be sort of large recommendation up front, and then I'll sort of hone it in a little bit more useful. Major recommendation up front is stop being so damn critical to each other. It is really important to appreciate that if somebody, especially with any bit of experience, is doing something, that there's probably a reason for it. I mean, I was an educator and an intel analyst long before I was a vendor. Worked sort of my whole career doing this work, and then wrote a course. And then when I went to become a vendor, we published and said, hey, we want to be open with the community. Here's 7 activity groups that we're publishing. And not to cry you deep vendor tears, but the moment we did that, all of our customers were super happy and had great feedback from customers. InfoSec analysts, like around the Twitter webs, it really, really got dramatic, and tons of people be like, why are you doing this? I can't believe you're doing this. Oh my gosh, you're just making it confusing. Can we agree not to use these? And it's just, we are a group of people, especially in InfoSec, that love to be critical of each other without necessarily even knowing why something was done. Like, I feel like I know a thing or two about Intel, and if I did something, especially with Sergio, who leads our Intel group, maybe there was a reason. So if we could all be a little less critical and try to be a little open mind, like, that's going to be important to actually advancing our field. If we want to be a profession and not just a vendor community, we must appreciate that the way people are doing things can be highly interesting. And I'm going to throw out I love political topics or anything close to them because they expose a lot of our biases and we have to think critically of them. Like, I think of the Kaspersky debate. It comes to mind for me all the time. There was a lot of good work that happened over and still happens over Kaspersky. And yet every time I want to talk about a Kaspersky report, I get thrown in my face, oh, what about these allegations? I'm like, okay, that's adorable. Can we focus on this report that I'm reading that's actually really well written? And can we look at the analysis because it was well done? We have to be a little bit more open-minded as Intel analysts. That doesn't mean other requirements and things aren't worth looking through and thinking critically of, but if we're going to move the profession forward, we have to be an actual community to some extent. Anyways, to be a little bit more prescriptive to your question, we need to understand that our requirements may not be those of our customers. If I want to do Intel, the thing that I care about most is tradecraft and and especially when we think of like intelligence gain loss discussions of how long do you let the adversary go before you sort of cut them off to be able to observe tradecraft, I am way wrong on this. I would let the whole infrastructure burn to the ground just to watch and learn new tradecraft. That's not good. That's not good for defenders. So I'm wrong. And I know I'm wrong, but that's my own personal bias. If I want to watch, I want to learn, I want to see it. So I know that if I value this stuff, that maybe my customers don't. And maybe the guy or gal that's running the proxy really needs an indicator feed. And I hate indicators, but you know what? That's what their job needs. So, okay. And you know what? I really want to focus on tradecraft, but my CSO really needs a threat briefing on threat actors in the sector because that's what the board is asking for, and they're actually using it for strategic value. Okay, well, I'm going to also have threat actors that I track for them. So in other words, long story short, understand the requirements of your consumers. Now, just because you get a requirement doesn't make it a good one. I've seen requirements or people push back, well, my executives wanted to see a picture of the adversary. That's a really bad requirement, usually. I mean, if you're not prosecuting or dropping warheads on foreheads, that's probably not going to be useful for you. So I might coach them and say, well, what are you trying to get out of that? And walk them through, well, I could do all that, but it's going to cost me this much resources. But for a smaller ROI, I can get everything you want by going a different direction. I can coach them on a better approach, and I can adapt the requirements to actually fulfill what I'm already doing, but do it in a way that actually benefits them. So long story short, you want to move the community forward, be less critical of other analysts. It's good to have debates. It's good to be informed and have debates. I love that. We have to be willing to have thick skin, but don't want to be critical. And we have to be in tune with the requirements of our customers, because the way we want to do business is not necessarily the way that our consumers are consuming it. All right, well, this has been super fun. I'm out of time. I appreciate you all paying attention. Good luck, have fun, and happy adversary hunting and tracking.
All right, well, thank you so much, Robert, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.